Hello and welcome to Tech Talk Community Conversations, the quarterly broadcast from Dr. Jill Bowen, Commissioner of the City of Philadelphia Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, in which we explore the work DBHIDS and our partners do together to address the key components of TEC, which stands for trauma, equity, and community. So now let's learn about TEC. Dr. Bowen?
Thank you, Mark. Hello, and welcome to Tech Talk Community Conversations, the video series in which we explore how the work we do at DBHIDS and with our community partners and providers aligns to address trauma, achieve equity, and engage community. Today, I'm joined by Antonio Valdes. Antonio is the Chief Executive Officer with the Children's Crisis Treatment Center, CCTC. He has been with CCTC for 25 of the 51 years it has been in existence. Tony, why don't you tell us a little about your work here and how it aligns with the priorities of trauma, equity, and community?
Thank you, Jill. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to start with a little bit about who we are. So CCTC, at the end of the day, is a children's mental health agency. One of the things that we're very proud of is that we are very mission focused. If you take a look at our brochure or our website, you're going to really notice that we are very focused on things that are directly associated with providing children's mental health services. So things that support that, that provide, complement that work. But we very much like to think that our contribution to the community is related to that subject. Now, I'm going to get into how we work with other groups and how we make that work through partnerships in a minute. But I'm going to start with the trauma concept, because I think if we're talking about CCTC, we need to really start with the trauma concept and where our history kind of has guided this for us. So for those who are not aware, the trauma department of CCTC, which is the largest children's trauma department in the city right now, was founded in 1989. I think it's really important to talk about that and how it makes us a little different and how trauma has been very much part of the fabric of who we are as an organization. Because as we know, the concept of trauma in our community was not really being discussed back in 1989. As a matter of fact, I've been here since 1997, and I remember my first probably 8, 9, 10 years, it felt like we were the only show in town. So I think that's very much defined a lot of who we are. But that was particularly important, the fact that we were providing trauma services since that time. It was particularly important in our decision to move forward with the sanctuary model. So over 15 years ago, CCTC had formally adopted the sanctuary model, a trauma-informed model for managing organizational culture. And I said it that way very much on purpose, because I think in our systems and in our communities, we tend to talk about trauma-informed from the perspective of how the people delivering the services deliver it to the people receiving the services. And we tend to try to communicate always from that perspective. I believe that this only works because you use it as a tool to create a culture, to manage organizational culture, to build a world where leadership, staff work together in certain ways, that we work together with our partners, that we work together with outside organizations, not just the families and children that we work with. And then it starts to become very much part of the fabric of who we are. And it's interesting because these three concepts of trauma, equity, and community are impossible to pull apart. And certainly that's been part of how we view things. So going back to 25 years I've been here, care coordination. And I bring this up because it's really critical to this equity and community concepts. CCTC has been committed to care coordination as part of what we do for in these past 25 years. So we have care coordination in every service at CCTC, whether it's paid for or not. We have always had staff who are very much involved in that kind of work. So as concepts like social determinants of health began to become more common, for us, it was just a very natural space because we had always had care coordinators. We used to talk about it, if I go back 20 years, we used to talk about it. How does a family who's either hungry or doesn't have a job focus on getting their kid to therapy? And that's how we used to talk about it. Obviously, the conversation's become more sophisticated since then. but this has always been part of the fabric of who we are and something that we very much value. And I think it's just a really good example of how these things blend. Now, how it goes into the concepts of DEI and include particularly the concept of equity, we can't get past. First thing I'd love to mention is the diversity of staff. If you look at our staff right now, and this has just been true for a long, long time, there's people that we serve currently identify as approximately around 45% African American, around 30% Latino, and then a mix of other things beyond that. Our staff is about 44% African American, about 31% Latino, and then a mix of other things. So these things don't happen accidentally. There's a conscious effort that's made to make sure that this is the way we work and we represent ourselves and make sure that we're connecting to these communities in those ways. We have, in more recent years, in the last 3 to 4 years, begun to implement more formal DEI programs at CCTC. We have a DEI council made up of staff that are very much working on how this stuff blends with the trauma work that we're doing and how these concepts, so we're building them together. We're not seeing them as separate. This trauma-informed very much is highly connected to this kind of work. Now, what is happening to us as we're having these conversations is we're moving from sort of that equality, equity into the justice space. And it's very much something that we care about. So we look at this from the perspective that one of the challenges that we have in our communities and the social service systems as a whole is that social service systems tend to be intervention-based and not foundational-based. So this is our belief and very much a value at CCTC is what we need to think of systems going forward is more around, we need to build systems that are built around creating foundations for children's families, not reacting to crises. We're waiting till something's gone bad before we're doing something about something. So the best example I can give that's it's in the news these days because there's actually bills going on in Harrisburg is the whole school, the way schools are funded, the way we think about schools in the Commonwealth, and what we need to be doing is really focusing on, based on certain socioeconomic factors of certain communities and so on, putting more resources in those schools. But the way the model currently works, we actually put less resources in schools that need the most help. Justice needs to be about lifting and creating opportunities and that's done through the foundational work that we do with people from the beginning when they're young children, that we create a system that does that. So it's very much part of how we think about things and is driving a lot of our advocacy work these days. And last but not least, in terms of answering this question, partnership and integration. I would say in the last 10 to 12 years, almost every new thing that CCTC has done has been in partnership with some group. And even prior to that, this was really born. We really got inspired to this when we started working with the West African community back in 2001 in Southwest Philly. And really the way we were able to integrate into that community and become part of the fabric of that community, and that our program became well known. And we did some things on purpose and some things accidentally. Some of the accidental ones really were the best decisions we made. But even the name, the fact that we presented a name, sometimes when people in that community, they know our program by the African name it has, and they don't know it's part of CCTC. Now, some people might say, well, from a branding perspective, you're losing an opportunity, and that might be true. But it's one of those little things that contributed to the integration. But then that fed into how we think about schools, how we think about. We have partnerships in health centers and integrated care programs in health centers. We've had partnerships in homeless shelters. We've had partnerships in charter schools and in public schools. All that, we start with a very basic concept that you're in someone else's home, and that we need to help understand what are their pain points, what are their challenges, help solve their problems, what their perceived problems are. And then as we build a relationship over time, we're able to gain trust, build a relationship, and then they lean on us for things that they might need from us. And we're also able to begin to contribute things that they may not have thought of up to that point, especially around the trauma-informed stuff. So you can certainly see our approaches to partnerships and integration are very much defined by how we view through the trauma lens, how we view all these challenges through that trauma lens.
So you haven't been busy over the last 25 years. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not.
So this is all, incredibly impressive. It's really very well aligned with the concept and our department's approach and vision to tech and the way in which we prioritize the programming, the resources, if they're aligned with tech, which is really intentional. So the intentionality that you speak to over the years is really interesting to me. So I want to hear a little bit more about you gave a good amount of history and some really great examples about how it manifested. That intentionality is clearly carrying through to the current world, and the current scenario, especially for the kids, is concerning. It's challenging. The amount of trauma that they're experiencing, whether it's related to the violence or it's related to centuries of racism, or it's related to poverty, or any of the social determinants that you referenced, or the challenges of being isolated during the pandemic, or the loss during that. So there's just multiple layers, right? And that's the reality that the kids are experiencing. So if you take what you discussed in terms of the foundation, the basis upon which you work, you think, you've organized, and all the benefits that really have come from that approach, and the intentionality behind it, and where you are today, how is that guiding, informing, and really helping you to help the kids find their way in this really very challenging time?
Well, I think, to steal some language from Sanctuary, I think very much when we think about the self model, the last letter in self is F, and it stands for future. And I think one of the things is the consistency with how we're talking about these things with kids and families, because it's not just the kids, right? But the consistency of how we're talking about this with kids and families is really always oriented towards future. One of the most obvious symptoms of someone who's experienced significant trauma is the fact that they start surviving. They go into their survival mode. And very much one of the characteristics of survival is that you're in the day, you're in today, and you kind of lose perspective about the future. That has many negative consequences in the quality of life to someone that's living. Once they're outside of the threat. Of course, once in the threat, it makes sense.
Right.
But once the threat is no longer there, then there seems to be dysfunctional behavior going on.
Like
so
you're stuck. Yeah.
Right. So we very much like to keep the language of future in our space. We do that as an agency. We do it very intentionally. So for example, while we were going through the pandemic and asking people to come back to face-to-face work, and we were having all these meetings and discussing how to intervene, well, there was part of our meeting that was always the reporting out on where we were with our strategic goals and what we were trying to do. So we never stopped working on, we assumed the pandemic would be over one day and that we were going to work on it. And so that's something that through really parallel work shows up in multiple layers, so that we're constantly talking about tomorrow, what's going to happen, how we're going to get there, because future is connected to hope and belief, and that I have something, there's a reason to sacrifice what I'm sacrificing today, because there's a payoff tomorrow in making that sacrifice. And it's really critical to help people see that and support them around that work, so that they see that they do have something in front of them. It doesn't mean we don't address the other stuff. It doesn't mean we're unrealistic. It doesn't mean we're all pie in the sky. But without that sense of hope and future, you lose it. So that's how one of the really critical ways the trauma lens contributes to, as a culture, how we view the work that we're doing. And I think that it's a roundabout way to answer your question, but it's very much, it's critical to how we think about things and how we view things. And if the staff feel it, the staff can project that, right? That's really important.
It feels like actually a really direct answer to the question. And I really appreciate that answer. And of course, the parallel between that approach, internally, or, with the organization, and then externally, and I'm not sure you make such a clear distinction, which is also, community, and being part of the community, from the way in which, you're speaking. But it does sound like that approach is one that has continued, like it's a flow. It's continuing to flow from, I think you're saying that was extremely, that the sanctuary model was extremely helpful in developing an organization that allowed that to continue to flow right through the pandemic and through and into today, where that future orientation is helping staff, it's helping families, it's helping communities, and it's helping the kids to be able to think in ways that are future focused, have positivity, have hope, looking for what is yet to come, without necessarily trepidation, but with some anticipation, perhaps. So I am really impressed with that. I am curious how much you do connect that back to the cultural shift through the sanctuary model.
Well, one of the things prior to this, we were a pretty open organization prior to 15 years ago. So we already had some sense of the trauma language. We did not have a formal program in place. We had a belief in care coordination already, and social integration was already part of developing for us. We had a lot of parties and events for our staff because we felt that sort of those connections, those glues that needed to be in place so that people would get to develop relationships and trust each other. But what we didn't have language was to package it, to make it intentional. I think most people go, well, how do you manage culture? I mean, you've got a great culture. How do you do that? Well, because it's like, because you don't really have even when you have something good going on, it can fall apart very quickly. Mm-hmm. So what Sanctuary did is it gave us consistent language. So having a true formal trauma-informed model gave us consistent language to package some of the things that we already believed in. But there were some new ones that came along with it as well. But then it had interventions. What do you do? So concepts like a collective disturbance. Mm-hmm. So we have a collective disturbance in this department. So, and that has meaning to us, and that has purpose. And then what do you do about it? There's an intervention that happens, and how we try to interpret why there's a collective disturbance and what you do about it. And there's a process using trauma language to analyze the issue and then intervene in some way. And each case is different, but just calling it a collective disturbance already makes it into, okay, the group has there's a disturbance. It's not like he's a bad guy, she's a bad guy. Like it's more about something's not right, and let's get to it.
It's a system and a community response, really, is what happens there. And not every organization that goes through the culture change, whether through the sanctuary model or other approaches, actually holds it as long as you're reflecting on it's been held, which again goes to intentionality for around turnover, folks who get onboarded. So if you could speak for a moment about that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so the first one is how it all began. So when we first received, it was a very random situation that happened that the week that I met Sandy Bloom, we received a grant to implement the sanctuary model.
Yeah, it's like
meant to be, right? And the story's even better than that, but that'll take too long. And when we went, I remember when we were going to do the 5-day training, I was assuming I was sending other people. or we're sending someone to learn something.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, I had the kind of relationship I had with my executive team, who turned around and looked at me and said, "Oh no, you're going. We're doing this together. We're doing this together." And so they really forced me to do this. We went up to New York. By the end of the first day, I thought I had joined a cult. and then sometime during the second day, as they say in the trauma-informed world, the light bulb went off. I got it. And part of it is I have an anthropology background. It's in from educationally speaking, and it was, and I bore people with concepts from anthropology all the time. And so it really, this idea of culture being a living thing became it just felt very naturally for me. So I say that to say, first things first, there is no question the fact that the executive team got trained first, that this was not viewed as an evidence-based practice or informed, we need to get the clinicians trained in this or the residential program trained in this. It was we made it an institutional commitment at that point from the top down. And I can't say enough about how much that matters, because if I look at where it's failed and versus succeeded, it's very much starts with the first question you should always ask, was leadership directly involved or not?
Right.
That would be my first question if anybody asks.
Right.
Now,
Right.
in terms of ongoing, we created a sanctuary implementation committee, and that stayed even until this past year, 15 years later, it was called the Sanctuary Implementation Committee. So the idea is, and there are all these activities that would come out of it, monthly activities every program would do, related to whatever theme we had that month, and we would pick different themes, the 7 commitments of the model, the self model, and then we'd rotate over an 11-month period, some activity, and then everybody in the agency, whether they were at one of our school sites, whether they were at our acute partial, whether they were here in our therapeutic nursery, didn't matter where they were, everybody was doing the same activity every month. So this was the kind of thing that you just start building very intentionally so that everybody's having the same conversation at the same time. And then there's a quality review process where the committee is looking and surveying people on particular tools. So are people using the community meeting correctly? Are they using, things like that? And asking people what they think of it. So all those things were really critical and to how this happens, because it's this very deliberate, and every 2 years we do a full staff survey about the effectiveness of sanctuary, where it's working, where it's not working. And we learn a lot from that, and that gives us information to really focus on certain areas that might be falling apart.
Yeah, and and there's no doubt in my mind that your leadership is instrumental in holding that and making it something that's alive and present and there, as you say, for the future. So I realized that not only did we go our full time, we actually went a bit past it. I really appreciate this conversation tremendously, and really glad to have you here with me today to talk about how your work aligns with the TEC approach of addressing trauma, achieving equity, engaging community, and just how much information you were able to share and provide that I think can be helpful to many others who I think are really struggling to find those ways forward. And I want to say, just basically thank you, Tony. It's pretty obvious to me that you are a TEC champion. And thanks to all of you for watching the DBHIDS Commissioner's Tech Talk. Our next Tech Talk community conversation will take place in April, when another guest will help us learn more about the important work our organizations do to address trauma, achieve equity, and engage community. Thank you, and have a good day, all.